So now I will introduce Sir Dr. Omyo P. Sen, retired as Professor of Modern Indian History from Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi. He has been Agatha Harrison Fellow, University of Oxford, Henrik Zimmer Chair, University of Heidelberg, Sivdasani Fellow at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, Oxford, and Visiting Fellow to the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, and the Centre for Contemporary Studies, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. To date, he has authored and edited 15 books and about the same number of articles. Sir, I would like to welcome for this FDP program and please enlighten us with your erudite deliberation. Please take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goswami. I don't know whether the presentation will be erudite or whether I'll be able to enlighten you, but nevertheless, I shall try. The subject that I'm going to be speaking on is about the academic study of religion, both in the colonial perspective and the post-colonial perspective. And before I proceed with the presentation, let me thank all the organizers who have done me the honor of inviting me to this presentation to speak before you. And it's been a very instructive exercise, as I can make out from what I heard yesterday and in the days to follow. I don't know whether what I shall say will be as equally instructive, but nevertheless, my first point of argument is about the fact that the FTP prima facie sounds like a refresher program. But you see, some of the subjects that you've chosen for people to speak on go outside the framework of a refresher course or an FTP. And for instance, if I am going to be speaking on the relevance or the validity of the academic study of religion, it has a larger bearing on a bigger question. For example, where do you place religion in civic society? That's a very big question, and I think the question has deeper implications than just a refresher course subject. So therefore, I proceed with the assumption that the fallout of this discussion, or what will follow, will have a larger bearing on questions that are worth deliberating on and thinking about seriously. Okay. Am I audible? Is there a problem, Hitch?
Absolutely fine, sir. You are audible. I will request all the participants to kindly mute their mic. Thank you. Please continue, sir.
Okay. As I said, this subject has a bearing on a larger question of where to place religion within the framework of civic life, especially in a democratic secular state like India, where there are immense complexities of relationships, of politics, of culture, etc., and so on. Having said that, let me briefly introduce you to what I'm going to do in this presentation. There are broadly two halves to this. First of all, I deal with an overview of what has been happening on this front. How has this subject of teaching religion to universities and postgraduate courses and religion as a research subject has proceeded in India, Indian academics and so on. And then I will come to certain observations and conclusions drawn from what I present in the course of the argument. But let me conclude here already, preempt my conclusions by saying two things. One of which is this, that while political parties in India have politicized religion, I think the Indian state has done the opposite. It has religionized politics, if I may use that expression, by which I mean the following, that it has actually used religion in the service of politics. I think religion, broadly speaking, and I hope others will agree with me here, has broadly two aspects to it. As Shankara said in the 9th century, it has a Vyavaharik aspect, a mundane, everyday aspect, and it has a transcendental aspect, something which cannot be dealt with in ordinary course of life. I think the definition of religion has to be made clear here, in the sense that when we use the word religion, we don't mean the transcendental aspect at all. I do not think that can ever be the subject of an academic discussion or academic deliberation. What we're dealing with here is basically the social face of religion, the political face of religion. So with that clarification, let me proceed with the presentation, as it were. There's a certain aptness in my attempt to speak on the chosen subject this evening, I should say. I was born a Hindu and remain one in thought and practice. My educational and professional career thereafter has been somewhat bizarre. I went to a school run by Jesuits, to a college run by the Protestant Church of North India, and spent roughly the last 10 years of my professional life at a university with a substantial Muslim presence. In North India, this is perhaps the only university which had a department by the name of the Center for the Study of Comparative Religion and Civilization, of which I served as an honorary director for about 3 or 4 years. In the meantime, in the middle of all this, I even managed to spend about a year at Tagore's Shantiniketan, Vishwabharati, where the influence of Brahmavism is still deep-rooted. So I suppose I have been exposed to religious cosmopolitanism, and I think that enables me and equips me to speak on this subject to some extent. It is customary to separate the academic study of religion from a confessional perspective. However, given my continued interest in religion, but more particularly in Hinduism, I have increasingly felt that one ought to also distinguish, albeit only subtly, an intellectual interest in religion from that which was purely academic. An intellectual interest in religion, I feel, is more natural, spontaneous, and does not seek to understand religion within the framework of any academic discipline or discourse. It is much less moved by critical theory and more existential in nature. It draws from ordinary life experiences. On the other hand, it may also be less objective or dispassionate in its approach and very likely to be influenced by the social and cultural formations in which a person is situated. I raise this question if only to argue that on one level, the question of pursuing an academic study of religion is deeply intertwined with the larger moral, intellectual, and political question of what place we assign to religion in everyday civic life. Understandably, this is an important question for a nation which, at least constitutionally, deems itself to be functioning as a democratic, secular state. The academic pursuit of religion did not commence with the foundation of modern universities. Even in 19th century Britain, from where we draw all our models, basically, the universities of Oxford and Cambridge were clearly dominated by an Anglican Protestant elite, with the result that nonconformists, Unitarians, and Jews had to fall back on alternative institutions. Such an institution was the University of London, which had to take administrative control of the King's College and of the University College, both located in London, but which adhered to very different views of faith, the question of religious instruction, and the regulation of student life on the campus. Even King's College, which was never as radical as its rival, the University College, was called by its critics as, I quote, godless college on Gower Street. It's actually on Gower Street, it used to be on Gower Street. To defend his honor and the position he stood by, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, you've all heard of him, sure, in the context of the French wars and so on. And then the Prime Minister of England had actually to go through the motions of challenging one of his persistent critics to a duel, which he fought and which he won. In 1857, when the first modern universities were founded in India, the East India Company decided to follow the University of London model, which was essentially a degree-granting university and not a teaching university. This at once solved problems related to the question of framing a suitable syllabus for students, the bulk of whom were not Christians, the regulation of student life on the campus, and spending little on the possible extension of Indian education. By the mid-19th centuries, I felt there were two contrary ideological pulls or pressures at work. On the one hand, there was an increasing tendency to reinforce the secular credentials of the modern nation state. The citizen's commitment to his private faith was expected to be subordinated to a sense of loyalty towards the state. This coincided with a greater emphasis on the study of historical religion, religion as evident in historical processes, subjecting the categories of God and religion to searching scrutiny. This enterprise was considerably aided by the birth of new academic disciplines, like sociology and anthropology. It cannot be fortuitous, it cannot be simply a coincidence that Auguste Comte, we heard of Auguste Comte a lot of times yesterday, taken to be the father of sociology, consciously stayed away from metaphysics. What came to be debated now was not so much the existence of God as how conceptions of God or religion might have taken birth and shaped matters like politics and economy. In Europe, these inspired the works of Renan, the French scholar, and Strauss, the German scholar, who interrogated the historical Jesus as against the divine Jesus, not Jesus, the Son of God, but the historical man, as it were. And still later, we have the bold new thesis advanced by Max Weber, again a sociologist, and R.H. Tawney, a historian, linking Protestant ethics with capital formation and bourgeois society. This was novel because for the first time, someone dared to project the possibility of religion influencing society, which was a very keen and an acute kind of perceptive argument to make at the time. Following the Darwinian Revolution, it was increasingly argued that secular work was just as pleasing to God as the advocacy of the Gospels. That religion was not more important than secular work, but even secular work pleased God if it was done well. On the other hand, it was also acknowledged increasingly that to be secular was not quite the same as being religiously illiterate, or that the study of religion amounted to its propagation. This was an important point because people now made the argument with some validity and force that the study of religion was not necessarily propagating religion. There was an intellectual and academic side to it, which was neutral. Differently put, this amounted to saying, and this is important, that there was nothing religious about studying religion. Just because you studied religion didn't make you religious necessarily. It was around this time too that they developed a genuine cosmopolitan interest. I think this came from the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, in comparative religion. We should remember Voltaire and his forays into religion of the Orient. Voltaire was the first European intellectual to take an interest in Chinese and Indian religion. And we know all about the Orientalist movement in India, which followed the Voltairean interest in non-European religions, non-Christian religions. They developed a genuine cosmopolitan interest in comparative religion, as may be seen from the institution of the Hibbert and Gifford lectures in 1847 and 1887 respectively. that aimed at promoting the non-sectarian pursuit of religion. In 1893, as we know, there was also the World Parliament of Religions hosted by the New World, that is the Americas, which was marked by a strong Indian presence. I believe there were as many as 12 to 14 Indian delegates to the Parliament of Religions at Chicago. The Indian delegation to Chicago included Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Muslims, and Parsis, and had the somewhat paradoxical effect of strengthening both Indian nationalism and Indian cosmopolitanism. Among other things, what this movement achieved was also to press the argument that a modern industrialized society had only weakened religious faith, not abolished it altogether, and that in itself, material advancement was ultimately hollow or without spirituality to back it. It was also increasingly realized that to deny the category of religion altogether, or not offer it an appropriate place in society or social life, amounted to denying one of the long-standing features of progressive left liberal philosophy, which was, and this is important again, the idea of religious freedom. This was an extremely important issue in Europe of the modern age, the question of religious tolerance. It hasn't surfaced as much in India because we had a different approach to religion altogether. But in Europe and in the modern world, the question of religious tolerance was extremely important. And I think to say that religious tolerance was not to be an issue agitated in the modern world is to deny a whole lot of history there. A new Indian perspective on religion was first evident in the very instrumental perspective adopted by Ram Mohan Roy, who thought that the objective before religion was primarily to secure, and I quote, these are his words, political advantage and social comfort. Writing a letter to his friend, I forget his name, an English friend, he says religion was all right, but religion had to secure these, properties, political advantage and social comfort. The point that I'm making here is that Ram Mohan was the first Indian to take a very, what shall I say, for the lack of a better word, not a secular perspective, a very instrumental perspective on religion. That religion has to serve other purposes. It cannot be taken as an end in itself. It has a social phase. And this is exactly what is a political phase too. He says political advantage and social comfort. And I think this came under the spell of the European Enlightenment. Surely Ram Mohan was influenced by that kind of notion there. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that the establishment and perpetuation of traditional institutions of learning, as for instance the Calcutta Madrasa or the Sanskrit colleges in Banaras and Calcutta, was seen as an antidote against the ideas of Thomas Paine. You all know about the story of how young Bengal bought the books of Tom Paine at a premium. Yeah, they were selling at black market prices, twice or thrice the stated amount. Such was the craze at the time for reading Thomas Paine and his revolutionary ideas. As an antidote against the ideas of Thomas Paine and the unsettling ideas born of the French Revolution, as I recall, Reverend Alexander Duff, a contemporary of Ram Mohan and the founder of the Scottish educational movement in Calcutta, you would know, once warned Ram Mohan to stay clear of the French Enlightenment and the French Revolution. After Ram Mohan, the next major commentator on Indian religion was Bankim Chandra, a figure with whom I'm sure you're all familiar, in whom we detect two major ideas or arguments regarding religion. First, he treated the idea of religion as a socially cohesive force, something which binds. And he's treating religion here as dharma. The word dharma, the term dharma comes from the Sanskrit root three, something which holds together. And Bankim was the first person, I think, and I'm sure some of you have read some articles or writings on this subject. Bankim was the first to correlate the terms dharma and religion. He translated religion as dharma and dharma as religion, which is not quite an academic exercise, but it is understandable why he did it. Anyway, for a time, therefore, Bankim was attracted to Comte, who, as you know, treated religion as a social entity, as a social force. But more importantly, Bunkim hinted at the pervasiveness, the ubiquity of religion. And there, one would have to quote a short passage from Bunkim. And please pay attention here because it's a very important and a telling passage which throws a lot of light on the understanding of religion and the role that religion played in 19th century society. I quote, it's from an essay by Bunkim called Letters on Hinduism. It's available in Bunkim Rachanavali if you just care to look up. I quote, with other people, religion is only a part of life. There were things religious and there are things lay and secular. To the Hindu, his whole life was religious. To the European, his relationship to God and to the spiritual world are things sharply distinguished from his relationship with man and to the temporal world. To the Hindu, his relation to God and his relation to man, his spiritual life and his temporal life are incapable of being so distinguished. What Bunkim is trying to argue is the pervasiveness of religion. That religion, or dharma as he understood it, enters into the every single aspect of the everyday life of the Hindu. Now, this is an important idea because I think, astonishingly, this is the idea which continues till the days of Gandhi. If you read Gandhi's understanding of religion and Hinduism, he is saying more or less the same thing, not in the same language, but the sense of it is quite the same, that religion or dharma informs every aspect of the Hindu's life. So it's an argument which stays on even after Bunkim, and I think it informs the Hindu sensibility throughout the 19th and 20th century. I imagine that the most prominent figures of the 19th century India must have sensed an inherent contradiction in the fact that whereas the underlying character of the Indian Renaissance was deeply religious, the curriculum adopted in schools and colleges had to be kept strictly secular. In 19th century Maharashtra, writers and reformers like Mahadev Govind Ranade strongly urged return to theism in place of agnosticism and skepticism. Orientalism, as you would know, deepened the notion of religion as the quintessential form of Hindu self-expression. And it is indeed noteworthy that at least in the case of Bengal, religion itself served as a site for social reform. Both the legal abolition of sati and the act enabling Hindu widows to remarry had to be backed by the argument that these had sanction in Shastra. Without the Shastric sanction, neither of these would have been possible, I think. I feel that in the domain of education and moral pedagogy, too, this tension between the secular and the spiritual was quite transparent in the work of some of our reformers and textbook writers such as Vidyasagar and Akhoy Kumar Dotto. In his personal life, Vidyasagar was something of an agnostic. But this did not lead him to banish altogether all references to God and religion in his textbooks. Contrary to popular belief, and this is a common perception that Vidyasagar, because he was an agnostic, never mentioned God and religion in his text. That's not quite true. Contrary to popular belief, his Bodhodoy, again, a book with which you might be quite familiar, and Akhan Manjari, did carry references to a creator God and one who functioned as a moral governor of the universe. Akhoy Kumar, notwithstanding his agnosticism, he had this famous formula about how prayer and no prayer are the same in producing something. You would recollect that. Despite his agnosticism, went on to produce a very useful survey of theistic cults in India, famously called Bharatvarsha Upashak Sampradaya. I think it was the best work of its kind in contemporary Bengal and India. This is a summary of all the religious cults that were prevalent in his time. It's something which built upon Wilson's work on religious cults in India. At Shantiniketan, around the same time, Tagore delivered a series of religious addresses and discourses to his students, which later came to be known as Shantiniketan lectures. As I understand him, Tagore was cosmopolitan and non-sectarian, never irreverent or atheist. As you would know, his entire repertoire of songs and poetry is deeply, deeply religious. This, as I've earlier pointed out, suggests a sustained intellectual interest. I want to emphasize that, an intellectual interest in religion as distinct from that inspired by either the doctrinal interest in religion or the academic interest in religion. These are categories which one has to be very careful about separating one from another. In 1882, the Hunter Commission, one of the several education commissions instituted by the government of India, the colonial government of India, sought to promote vernacular education in India, suggested, perhaps under some pressure from Christian missionaries, that students had to be introduced to basic principles of natural religion. However, this idea was rejected by the government of India in 1884, arguing that a work on natural religion would please nobody. And I think they had a point. The Indian Universities Act of 1904 reflected important changes occurring in contemporary Britain itself. I said in the very beginning that in India, educational policy followed very closely developments in Britain itself. In 1898, the University of London changed from a purely degree granting university to a residential cum teaching university. And I think that called for changes in the definition of universities in India itself. From 1904 onwards, Indian universities combined the functions of granting degrees, teaching, research, and administration. That was an important change in the history of higher education in India. In the 1920s, primarily under the influence of Gandhi, they resumed some serious rethinking on the subject of religion. Gandhi was instrumental in revising and replenishing the older argument about how a materially advanced West could remain considerably poor without a sense of spiritual notification. He was also quick to catch the pulse of the nation with his belief that given her complex plurality of religious and cultural traditions in India and the degree to which religious sensibility permeated everyday life, the rigid separation of the state from religion, as in the West, would be unacceptable in India. You could not really separate state and the religion very rigidly in India. That was Gandhi's argument. He is very famously or unfamously gone on record saying that his politics was religious and his religion was based on politics. He admitted this very openly. In my understanding, this is quite evident in his indictment of Western civilization, as in his hymn Swaraj, if you read it carefully, and in his insisting that Indian politics could not be divorced from religion. The Mahatma clearly had a different notion of the secular and the secularism, that one that sometimes took him away from the position officially adopted by the Congress. Rightly or wrongly, Gandhi genuinely believed that religion itself carried the resources for promoting interfaith goodwill and through that uphold the secular credentials of the Indian state. This is an argument which, as you would know, Ashish Nandy has made very forcefully in recent times. It is important to note here that the religious universalism of Gandhi included both the minimalist and the inclusive conceptions of universalism. What are these? First, it saw universalism as comprising some core and fixed principles in all forms of religious life. But also, it was willing to systematically adopt certain chosen traits from various religious traditions. In the ashrams that Gandhi ran, Sabarmati and elsewhere, all the inmates were required to participate in prayer meetings which involved holy thoughts drawn from various religious traditions in the observance of common festivals and so on. So this was syncretism or universalism not effected through subtraction, but by addition, which is interesting and important. In Gandhi's understanding, each religion had something unique to offer. For example, he identified love as a distinguishing feature in Christianity, strict monotheism for Islam, karuna or compassion for Buddhism, the many-sidedness of truth, Anikantavada, as in Jainism, and the cosmic unity of all life in Hinduism. Thus, religious harmony had to go beyond mere respect or toleration to a state of active borrowing from one another. We also know that by the 1920s, Gandhi very dramatically, and this is dramatic because I don't think anyone else or after him had done this, he inverted the traditional saying that God is truth to saying that truth is God. This is a very dramatic and a very, very important reversal that he brings about. What does it mean, really? I think by doing this, Gandhi was underscoring an attempt to create a greater moral space within religions, something which is more universal, less denominational, less insular. Between 1938 and 64, all education commissions instituted in India carried the imprint of Gandhian ideas. The Zakir Hussain Commission of 1938 recommended that all institutions of higher education in India take special care to promote in students a mutual respect for all religions. In 1948-49, the Radhakrishnan Commission recommended that the daily life in universities and colleges start with a brief session on meditation, and that a basic knowledge of all world religions be taught to students of the first year degree course. It also made a pointed reference to the preamble of the Indian Constitution, which spoke of, within quotes, a national faith and a national way of life that was essentially democratic and religious. Hence, religion has taken to be deeply spiritual and not narrowly dogmatic. Religion was to be spiritual and not dogmatic. Seeking religious concord was far more productive than to be embroiled in conflicting truth claims. Everyone said that his or her religion was the truth. This Gandhi completely rejected. The commission also concluded on the important note that just as scientific or technical education could not be left to the care of families, the moral and religious grounding of the individual could begin at homes, but find its completion or fruition only under the care of an ethically and responsible state. The state, in other words, has a positive role to play in producing the ideal citizen, and state-funded universities were indeed the best institutions to carry out a creative but dispassionate study of religion. The Sri Prakasha Commission of 1959 expressed great concern at the rise of materialism and careerism at the expense of traditional values of Indian civilization, on the level of both interpersonal and intercommunity relations. It expressed the hope that an objective and sympathetic study of religions other than one's own will go a long way in diffusing the potential threat from public animosity and violence. The Kothari Commission of 1964, the commission on, it was the other word, the actual wording of the commission was Commission on Education and National Development, deliberated on the issue for about 2 years. Its report came out in 1966, and it recommended combining a spirit of science and spirituality. Now, this was a brief survey of what happened during the colonial and post-colonial periods. What conclusions can I draw from this? I realize that my time is about to end, and I shan't take more than 5 to 7 minutes from here on to complete my presentation. First of all, and I give this to you in points so that you can think about these and come back with your critique or discussion, either way. First of all, I think we've clearly failed in devising what the various commissions have called a national religion for India, a national way of life. I don't think that has ever come about since the 1940s. In 2002, there was a university handbook which had surveyed as many as 273 institutions of higher learning, and it came out with the very astonishing for us today, that only about 5% of these 273 institutions, and mind you, these do not include colleges, these are just universities and places of higher learning. only 5% of these institutions had anything to do with religion at any level. Of the institutions that dealt with religion at any level, as many as 13 were engaged with Islamic studies, 3 with Buddhist studies, none for Hinduism. Which is astonishing because, as you know, Hindus constitute about more than 80% of the Indian population. Even Oxford has the Center for Hindu Studies, not India. This is something which we really have to grapple with, and something which the administrators and politicians and the policymakers of the Indian nation really have to think about. Second, for a long time, I think keeping out religion from academic pursuits or even intellectual studies, very broadly speaking, was the residual effect of the hegemony of what I would loosely call the Nehruvian left progressive idea of the suspicion about religion as causing all kind of civic discord. I've had teachers in my university days who clearly said, and you'd probably be amused to hear this, they clearly said that without Marx, we could not give you Marx, right? So unless you quote Marx in your writings and your tutorials and your examinations, you cannot expect Marx from us. They were absolutely dominated by a Marxian kind of thinking. And I think this still continues at some levels in some universities, which we really have to rethink. Third point, our utter failure to make the academic study of religion viable also rests on the fact that we have not vocationalized religious studies. Why would anyone do religious studies unless there were jobs waiting for him or her after he or she had completed the course of studies? Speaking from my experience at Jamia, the students who took an MA or MPhil or PhD courses at Jamia under the rubric of comparative religion and so on were those who did not find admissions anywhere else. Number one, I'm being very frank about this. And they took it for the simple reason that admissions in a course entitled them to certain facilities, like a bus pass, a damn cheap bus pass, and hostel accommodation in the university. They were least interested in religion as an academic study, was an academic subject. So these are realities which we have to grapple with. Unless you create jobs, I mean, look at Harvard, look at Western universities. For hundreds of years, they've had faculties teaching religion in a rigorously academic manner. The Harvard School of Divinity is not a theological seminary. It's an academic institution which treats religion as an academic subject. So why can't we have this here? That's my question. The institutions which now undertake the study of religion, there are very few of them, as you know, maybe Patiala, Vishwabharati, Jamia, one or two more, are being very insular about it. If you go to Patiala, all you have to do is to study 6 studies. That's the only option before you. In Vishwabharati, there is a very strong emphasis on Brahmanism. It's understandable, but that's not the way to understand religion. In Jamia, it is Islam. So what is cosmopolitan about studying your own religion in a university setup? Unless you study other religions in a comparative mode, what is the point of it all? That's the argument that I'm making. The following point is important. I think, and I made this in the very beginning, instead of separating religion from politics, 2 things have happened which are both despicable, and I think they need to be corrected as soon as possible. While political parties have politicized religion, as I said, the Indian state has used religion to the service of politics. It has tried to invent a religion which will, please everybody and create amity among religious communities, but it doesn't work that way, really. It doesn't work that way. religion is a subject by itself, and it should be studied as a subject, not as a means to an end. Please don't make religion a means to an end of something which is not related to religion at all. Have I finished my time? I have, I think.
Yes, sir, but we can take some questions right
Yeah,
now.
I think we would rather invite questions, and I think that may open up new avenues of discussion rather than continue with this. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, sir. I would like to thank you for your presentation, which is informative, analytical, and contributes towards the growth and development of various discourses on religious studies, which I believe. I must say, I need to enhance my understanding of religious studies more so that I could get enlightened by your talk. Right now, I am a novice in this regard, but I have some queries. So before that, I would like to take up the questions first, which have come in the chat box.
Yes.
So the
I hope they're
first
not too
question,
difficult.
no, sir, please. So the question by Shantanu De, what promise does the academic study of religion hold for our future if the university system is not forthcoming?
Sorry, I mean, could we
Shall I
ask
repeat,
Shantanu?
sir? What?
I heard you, but the
Yeah.
meaning of the question was not very clear to me. What exactly does Shantanu mean to convey? I mean, can we hear him?
Oh,
Could he put the question to me?
sure, sure. Dr. Shantanu De, could you please unmute yourself? Dr. Shantanu De, can you hear me? Could you please unmute yourself?
I'm sorry, I
Tash,
couldn't make sense of the question right away. Maybe if he speaks.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I just wanted to know exactly, since you are a scholar who has been working on religion for a long time, if the university system doesn't allow us or doesn't give us the space for the establishment of academic departments in religion, what promise does the future hold for us, scholars who have been in some way working with religious studies in some shade or the other?
Okay. I now sense the meaning of your question, but it wouldn't be fair to say that universities don't allow space for religious studies. They do, of course, not to the extent that we expect them to do. I mean, there are about half a dozen universities at least, I think, which have faculties of religion, comparative religion, studies in civilization. Or that's not the point. The point really is that other than granting you a degree in a certain course, it does nothing more. You see, what will a course, an MPhil course or an MA course in comparative religion lead to, as far as you are concerned? You won't get a job on that basis. You see, unless you create jobs on religious studies, jobs related to the study of religion as a separate a niche, as it were. I mean, just like history or sociology or anthropology, why can't religious studies be a department by itself? That universities will have to create. Unless there is a vocationalization of religious studies, purely academic study of religion will get you nowhere. That is my feeling. You have to create jobs. I mean, in the West, as some of you would surely know, those who have been experiencing the academic structure in the West, people undertake religious studies because they know there is something to follow after that. They can latch on to viable academic programs which will lead to jobs at various universities. And why does this come in the way of secularization? I mean, I don't understand. What is non-secular about the Harvard Divinity School? I mean, even America is a multicultural, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic society, just as we are. But they don't scruple about not admitting religious studies in a bigger way than we do. So, I mean, that is really the point. There is space for religious studies. The question is, how do you make practical and concrete vocational openings for that kind of academic pursuit. Unless that is done, it will get you nowhere. Would you believe it? When I examined the syllabus of the comparative religions in MA course in Jamia, they had something like the Chartist movement as a part of the syllabus. Now, what on earth has the Chartist movement got to do with religion? So they had no idea what they were doing. They just simply had to borrow in patches things from other courses and fit it into religion. If that is the attitude towards religion, it'll never work. Religious studies have to be given a certain autonomy and not mixed up with other disciplines. We may adopt an interdisciplinary approach to religion, but religion is not the same as other disciplines. It is a separate discipline by itself. Okay, I hope I have answered his question.
Thank you, sir.
What are the other questions?
Sir, there are many questions we have. Even I have some queries also. So due to the paucity of
but
time.
There's no time. You can send them to me by mail and I'll try and answer them.
Yes. So we would like to take one more question. This is by Shani Shabnam, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. So her question is, thank you, Professor Sen, for this immensely enlightening lecture. My question, do you think in the Indian context, the term secular has ever been understood as non-religious or completely separated from the religious?
Well, the brief answer to that is cannot be. I think our civilizational processes and our understanding of religion, as I tried to read out that passage from Bunkim, we understand or have been understanding religion in a very different sense. Western secularism will never apply to India. The pervasiveness of religion or religious sensibility is very, far, far deep in India than it is in the West. And surely we cannot practice historical secularism as it developed in the West in the 18th and 19th centuries. That cannot be replicated in India. I think we'll have to devise and formulate new conceptions of secularism. And I think someone rightly pointed out that secularism in the Indian context is amity or sarva dharma sambhava in this subcontinent. It's amity and concord between religious traditions. It is not the rigid separation of religion from the state. That will never work. That's my understanding.
Thank you, sir. Even I also